trying to fill 1 million or more job openings in the state over the next 10 years. She also serves on the governor's workforce cabinet, which is a group that's dedicated to shaping education and workforce training for a 21st century workforce. And before she joined the state, she was the mayor of LaPorte, Indiana. So she knows a little bit about community engagement. She's really one of the bright lights, one of the bright intellects in our state. And I'm really thrilled that she's joining us. She's also been talking a lot with Diamond and April. And she's working on what I call, she might call it something different, a hybrid of asset-based community development that I think she hopes to get up and running soon. So welcome, Blair. Glad that you're here, and perhaps you can say a few words about what you've been working on.
Well, Rick, thank you so much for the opportunity to join, and even more so the leadership that you are offering this group and beyond with really critical conversations. And it has been such a blessing for me to get to meet Diamond and Shauna and many of the partners that we are hoping to continue collaborating with, some of the ambassadors across central Indiana that we are looking to be able to further connect with. And before I go much further, I have to share that I am very much a student and learning so many things already this morning, and in so many of the conversations across the community that we've gotten to have thus far. And I anticipate learning so much more, discovering so much more all along the way. And that's what I think makes this really fulfilling in many ways, because it's being able to have these sort of aha moments almost all the time of all the different kinds of connection points that can be made of, and seeing just the passion that people have is fantastic. So I'll share a little bit about the concept that we're working with from the governor's workforce cabinet perspective. And again, this is still a work in progress that we're learning as we go, which is what's interesting and exciting about it. And I'm so thankful that Diamond and Shauna Murphy have the same attitude about it. We'll figure it out as we go along here. And so the concept stems from some of the work that we've seen take place in central Indiana, and particularly some of the work that Central Indiana Community Foundation has been doing with particularly 6 ambassadors that they identified in the Indy region. And I thought that last session on roving listeners and getting to hear from some of the roving listeners was really, really impactful and very similar, the basic concept of what we're trying to do. But we want to look at that from a statewide perspective. And so we're trying to build off of the model that is being utilized in central Indiana of they have 6 ambassadors that provide some input to CICF, which is the community foundation, on just various different kinds of things that they are learning about across their neighborhoods. And so, like I said, we're looking to do this statewide, and in central Indiana, as well as identify 6 more from different communities across the state. And we're looking to identify them from Lake County, from Allen County, from St. Joe, and from Vanderburgh County. And the idea is to be able to provide the governor's workforce cabinet with some opportunities to better connect racial and ethnic minorities to education and in growing career fields, and to be able to assist more minority-owned businesses by developing reciprocal relationships amongst community and policy leaders. And so I just read to you the sort of specific language that is a part of how we're developing this. So it kind of goes to your point, Rick, of a bit of a hybrid that we're trying to be able to figure out how we better connect some of these different pieces of what's beautifully and organically happening in our communities with some of the more with the structures of government, and how do we bridge some of those divides that oftentimes exist. And so that's where I'm so excited to be able to learn from the ambassadors that we're going to identify across the state to particularly serve into providing some insights for the governor's workforce cabinet. And one of the first things that we're going to be doing is providing some feedback to first the policy committee, and then the cabinet itself is providing recommendations that the governor has asked for from the cabinet specifically on how we improve opportunity and access for individuals of color to education and employment resources. And so this is all part of the effort to think about, and I am such a fan of the book that Pastor Mather wrote, and Diamond and Shauna are superstars within, as well as many others, where he talks about not just involving people, but being involved with people, and thinking of what does that look like from a governance structure, and how do we better identify what those assets were, and what the assets in our community are for being able to connect people up to education and employment opportunities. And are they things that that the state can better invest in? Are there things that we can better connect people to different kinds of opportunities? And I don't necessarily know all of the things that we're going to find along the way. And I think that's part of the journey, or part of the beauty of this journey that we're going to be on. I can't wait for us to get started. We're embarking on an anticipated at least year-long endeavor of being able to connect with our ambassadors and continue learning from them. And as I've seen so many different things that the Learning Tree puts together, the is that the individuals share some of what they're learning, what they gather can vary in a wide variety of ways. So some of my role will be trying to be able to gather that feedback in the mediums that they find to be most impactful, and be able to share those, and also kind of help do the government side of translating some of these pieces in the ways that we still communicate, but find ways to bring that this way of gathering insight and the true beauties of what's happening in our community, all the awesome people that we have in so many different places, but we just don't always see because we don't always ask the right questions. And so that's kind of our approach that we're taking right now, and happy to answer whatever questions I can at this point. But I think I probably have just as many questions as you do, and that's kind of the point of what we're discovering here.
And before we get into questions, which I think we should ask Blair some questions since we have her, I should mention that Blair and I've had conversations with Diamond in April, and Blair too, about government's role in this. And when we get into a discussion here shortly about structure, that does make it kind of interesting, because you have different levels of involvement in this. So a couple things that I wanted to say. One is, you'll notice that the first work that the states can be doing is in communities with people, of color and ethnic minorities. But I get the sense in the discussion we had with Blair that she's very interested in spreading this out across the state in some fashion, and moving it beyond the first, I guess we would call them pilots. The other discussion that I had with Blair that it was really important to me is this whole trust thing that we talked about earlier today. And she's aware of the fact that there are a lot of people who don't necessarily trust government. And the sense that I got in the conversation with Blair is, number one, she recognizes that, and number two, is really committed to figuring out how to build trust so that the state can become an absolute essential resource as we move forward with these kinds of initiatives. And I believe that is the case. I see Blair nodding her head, so I don't think that I went through a curveball at her.
Not at all. And I was just going to say, I mean, this question of trust is one that fascinates me and on a lot of levels, because I feel like there's a lack of trust in a lot of different areas. Government is one of many institutions that I feel like there's been a lot of change, and there's certainly been a number of things that have happened that have caused trust to be broken, and or for trust and relationship just to not be there. And like I said, government is one of many institutions that as we think about society as a whole, then I'm consistently thinking about how do we help people build those relationships to feel trust with one another, to feel trust with institutions that play important roles in society, and in order to have them continue to serve the different kinds of functions in a wide variety of capacities. So I have the opportunity to serve in the government sector, and so this is, and I have a certain passion about how government serves all people, and in order to do that well, there has to be trust amongst all the people that it should be serving. And there's just a wide variety of reasons as to why that trust and relationship doesn't exist or has been broken. And that's where I think through some of the last conversations you saw on the video, of where you see people just having conversations with one another, getting to know one another. And in this society where there can be so much acrimony between individuals, oftentimes because they don't know one another, then having the intentionality of conversations, of asking people what they love, what motivates them, what gets them off the couch, that's such a great way of building trust in community, in society, and certainly as we think about how we're connecting people to opportunities that are critical, such as educational resources and employment resources, understanding how people find that information and what they want to be able to do. And you listen to Jalen and some of his passion of how he wants to translate his interest in sneakers into being an entrepreneur. And so I think that you can't get to some of those different kinds of conversations and understanding how we can best support a system for people to connect up without having these kinds of conversations that allow people to feel a sense of connection and relationship. And that's all going to be a part of the journey that we'll take here. And the last piece I would say on this element is that, Rick, you're right that right now we're focusing on being able to be intentional with some of the conversations of how we better connect to individuals of color and ethnic minorities. But I think that as we are purposeful and intentional about building that trust, it is about recognizing that we need to think more about how we meet people where they are, and looking at different kinds of approaches that we take. And so the next conversations I would love to get into at some point are thinking about how we're much more intentional with our rural populations to be able to engage in these kinds of discussions and relationships, and how does that look, which I hope serves as maybe a precursor for the conversation to come of talking about structures and how we build this with the information that we learn from such critical conversations like we just heard about.
Anyone have any questions for Blair before we get into the next section?
She just started to answer this a little bit, Blair. Obviously we're sitting here in Noble County. This is a rural community. And, for years I served as the chair of the licensure board for occupational therapy. Okay. And the reason that I got there was because my mentor told me to put my money where my mouth was when I talked to him about, we don't have a rural voice in laws and regulations being made at the state regarding our profession. And he said, well, then shut up and do something about that. And I think that, he really pushed me to do that, but doing that gave me the courage to have a little bit more backbone to say, you know, we are not often heard in the rural community, and it's, you know, it makes it difficult for us to have resourcing sometimes. We don't have the population necessarily that is looked at, or, you know, we often don't have enough people that are willing to step up and speak up. Mm-hmm. So I think for me, it's very important, as, you know, as we've, and I've engaged in some other entities. I've engaged with some other entities that go to a state and national level about how what they're doing in their offices impacts us locally, and sometimes very negatively so. Mm-hmm. So I'm glad to hear you say that, you know, you are going to look at that, and, you know, would very much extend an open opportunity for you and an open invitation to engage this group, Noble New Way, in giving you some of that feedback, and in helping you to take those steps into the rural community.
Well, I really appreciate that, and have every expectation that I'm going to take you up on that offer. And hopefully we don't come to a point that you regret making that offer, that then I'll be calling you all the time. That a couple of pieces in response. First would be that I can fully appreciate some of the dynamics that go on within community and state, and having been a mayor, and then recognizing the different kinds of constraints that exist within the various realms, which oftentimes, candidly, can be a frustrating journey on various aspects. And so as I will say that I've already learned within probably the last couple of months, and particularly with conversations with Diamond and then talking with Pastor Mike too, that, you know, when I started thinking through what can this structure look like a little bit differently, how do we better incorporate community voice in the kinds of decision making that's happening, that I originally was of a mindset of, well, are there ways that we can kind of have a you know, community task force or something that we periodically touch base with, and maybe we end up going that route eventually. But I will say some of my learning journey has been to the point of what is called out in the book that I think just got put in the chat, as he talks about, don't just involve people, be involved with people. And that's where I'm trying to think through, okay, how do we learn the deeper lessons earlier on, so it's not just kind of an afterthought of, oh yeah, we got to make sure that we run this by so-and-so beforehand, which is certainly a step in the right direction in some cases where there may not even have been that any kind of engagement. But how do we better integrate first asking some of the right questions, and then ensuring that that's helping inform a sort of holistic picture about what we're all trying to accomplish. So I feel like I could go down so many different rabbit holes in these conversations, and I know that there's great conversation to be ahead of time. And so I'll just close by saying I really appreciate the opportunity, and want to continue thinking through how do we be involved with what you're doing, not just get you involved with what we're doing, something, if that makes sense.
That's it. And Rick, as we talk about structure, one of the things we want to encourage Blair to do is to jump in, because I think you brought a critical point about what does government has to do, what does policy have to do with this conversation.
Well, and I think someone else brought up earlier, it might have been Megan, who talked about the hoops that have to be jumped through on how things are measured from a government standpoint, which kind of flies in the face of what we're trying to do here. And that's like turning around the Queen Mary, right? And getting people to think differently about what are the metrics and what are the measurements. So I don't know, Diamond, I don't know if you want me to start or not, but my biggest question in all of this has been, and I think it's probably the question that a lot of people sitting here today have. Someone asked it earlier. How do you do this? And what is the structure? Because the way this thing is designed is it's designed with a certain amount of organic influence. And what we are used to is we are used to having a top-down approach with mandates that we have to meet. And this is exactly the opposite. This is how in a community do you get the community to run the show. And so I posed that question to you before. I'm going to pose that question again. I'm probably going to have some questions too. Is it, for instance, how is government involved? How are the influential people in a community involved, or should they be involved? Should they get the thing started and then the community takes it over? In the case of Indianapolis, it was a church that sort of led it, and it's a church that, in many respects, continues to lead it. It continues to be a central point. But we've also had discussions about, well, maybe a church may be problematic because some people may walk away from it because they don't want to be involved with something that's associated with a church or associated with religion. So the answer to this question falls in your lap. It's all you, Guy. It's how do these people in on this call take this? I think everybody understands the concept.
That's right.
But how do they take this and make it happen?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've learned, the concept and the practice is going all the time, but it doesn't add impact without our major institutions shifting things. And I think the greatest example of the first thing that I would say needed to happen is the power shift. And Blair did that by showing up in the spaces she's been showing up. It has to be a practice of the institution. And so for Broadway, why Broadway becomes a critical story, because in the 50s and the 40s, it used to be the largest church in the state of Indiana. It had 3,000 members in its heyday, 187 committee slots. For those who attend church knows what happens with 187 committee slots. There's a lot of reporting. But the thing was, what we were reporting on at the time, built also by policy, was how we did not have the confidence in the people we said we served in, and meant the people who lived around us. And at one point, Broadway, in its it stayed through white flight. So white flight happened, membership started to go down. A lot of Black and brown faces surrounds it, and it's surrounded with programs. I think at one point we had to start asking ourselves, as our membership is shrinking, right? We have 187 committee slots, and a fraction of its heyday, we were living scarce. So to do this work, we also had to cultivate a structure to do that. And one of the things that I'll say, Rick, that it is unfair to ask institutions, so corporate groups of people, to make this shift without having them leave the things behind. So the first thing in a structure that has, after we decide that we're going to share power as an institution. So if you work for institutions or connected with them, boards, starting from your board all the way down to the staff, how do we share power? Then the second is, how are we going to grieve the things we aren't doing anymore? So this work causes institutions to give up, right, the scarcity work. And so one of the things we did, an example at Broadway, I'm not saying that people should do this, but we are a church. We got rid of all of the structures that wasn't required by the United Methodist Church. So we kept the governing body, the finance committee, and there's a couple more. And we started to reshift that. And I remember Reverend Mike pulling his hair out because he was afraid that it was going to collapse. But it was the members of the congregation, the people in part of the corporate body, the people who make the donations, who run the programs, who have passions and gifts, who made those decisions. Almost kind of like our democracy. So we started on Sunday, not doing anything new, but using the structure we had in place to take a moment in time to bury and grieve the things we weren't doing. And I remember a short little story. The first thing we started to grieve was this clothing pantry that it was in the bulletin every week, right? It wasn't happening even though people were still bringing clothes in. Can you have in the room that the clothes were stored in were piled up to the ceiling, right? And so people were ashamed of that. So what we did on a Sunday, it was got up everybody. We had a lay member of our church get up and say, everybody that participated over the years in the clothing pantries, would you please stand? And we thanked them for the hard work that they did. And we said at the end, well done, good and faithful servant. And we would corporately say that together. And I remember the first time that happened, after we said that, it was silence and we looked confused. But it was clear it was done. And a series of those things helped us be able to make room for things that are positive and more mobile in the work we were doing. So grieving is one of the things that I say is very important.
So that's all well and good. I'm going to throw, I'm going to throw this.
Go ahead,
at you.
Rick.
So at Northeast Indiana Works, we oversee all the Work One centers. We oversee them for the Indiana Department of Workforce Development. Blair knows all this stuff. Blair also knows, I'm using us as an example, because I know a lot of people else on this call, they're dealing with bureaucratic hoops that they have to jump through. And we are governed by something called the Workforce, Workforce Innovation, and help me out here, Blair. Anyway, it's called WIOA.
Workforce Innovation Opportunities Act.
I don't know why I couldn't remember that. So we're governed by certain sets of metrics. And I have to be honest with you, those metrics, if you were to look at them, probably look at negative things and need, and probably people who walk into those centers, we require, not consciously, we require, yeah, thanks, Angie. We require that the people basically tell us that they're not doing well, right? What I like to call it is we re-victimize people. We make people come in and we make them prove that they're in a world of hurt. And then if they prove it, then we give them something. So I think, I'm not saying it was difficult at the church, but now we're talking about bureaucracy that is so embedded at so many different levels. How do we deal with that?
So I think I just talked about one, you can't do it without getting rid of the old things you have. And you know how long it took us to grieve everything? Like we got down to where it was always done that way and everybody laughed and cheered, right? That took 6 years in a small organization. And so what we also say that this work is 100-year work, because the structures you're talking about has been created over time, right? And they're very mechanical. So for an example, I was at the Kettering Foundation in Kettering, Ohio, and I was listening to John McKnight and Edgar Kahn debate about structures. And I remember Edgar telling John, I said, you know, that the structures our institutional structures are made for manufacturing. And he said, those are square structures. There's a schematic, there's a way you do it. And if you deviate it, things go haywire. But they're not made for humans. You know who built those structures or those cars or those things that we manufacture as humans? And they're much more fragile, right? Much more not as predictable at times, especially when some of those monkey wrenches get thrown in the way. And he said, what we need instead of square structures of the 20s and 30s is we need blobs. And so my son's a molecular biologist. He teaches at Purdue right now. And I kind of went back to him and said, hey, are organisms structures? And he said, absolutely. He said the things that our bodies are so much more complex than a schematic. There is a schematic, but there's things you cannot predict. in a short amount of time. And he says it takes time to do that. He's building some protein for Alzheimer's. And he said that one of the things about structures that they have to be created so it can change. And if I fail at my research, the best thing that happened is it can be passed over time. The thing that I did most is I can build that. So how do we shift and change those structures?
Right.
So
So I'm gonna lead you to that because I'm gonna ask that question. But I know that you got a big grant down at Indy, and the metrics and measurements that you used for success are going to look like they came from Mars. But I just want you to share a couple of them to show how different it looks when you change the measurements.
It's absolutely. So to set that up, several years ago, I was with the top executive at a local hospital who've been good friends, also former United Methodist pastor. And I'm always going to introduce people to him. And he says, "Hey, how come you don't ever ask me for money?" I said, "Because your metrics are wrong." I said, one, theologically, you know that deliverable is not promised, and you can't even promise a deliverable. So I won't ask for money. And he says, "What way would you ask for money?" I said, "If you make that measurement discovery." And that happened for me, that realization over time. So in that discovery, I talked about time, the 100-year work. Everything that's happening that I'm about to tell you, that was not a mastermind of mine, right? But it was a group of people that created a culture and a structure to do something. And first thing was relationships. So Blair mentioned the Central Indiana Community Ambassadors. So our little, consultant company, communities consultant company, has the learning contract from that. So over that, we have roving listeners kind of out in the city. And one of the things during the pandemic that hit was this idea of CARES Act money. The first round of CARES Act money was $30 million in the city of Indianapolis for rent assistance. Seeming like a good thing, but one of the things that ended up happening is that people were complaining how they couldn't get through the system. So tasked to, through a relationship, we got introduced to one of the deputy mayors, and he would join the calls with these ambassadors. And they gave him a hard time talking about how this process don't make sense, it's not centered. And he'd come back several times. And one day, one of the ambassadors asked him and said, he showed up a map where all the poor people were. And they said, "You know, that story tells me if we saw all the dark blue spots, meaning that's where people need the most rent, tells me two things. That one, people are short on money." And then it was Wild Style. And the second one, he said that that shows me that people aren't invested in. And so Jeff, deputy mayor, called Wild Style and myself to a meeting. And he said, "So I'd like to be more abundant. In what ways could we do that?" I said, "Well, one, I think you've heard a lot from the resident ambassadors about they know their neighbors can help build this project. And so what he ended up coming back with a proposal, all resident led, was about $25 million into housing in 3 ways. So this is not the money for rent assistance. Here's what he did. He allocated $500,000 to the community ambassadors to help with their neighbors to allocate out money for rent assistance. And what they did was only use the paperwork that was needed. So to get this rent assistance, it's a very short thing. And you listening to a neighbor, another neighbor is employed or utilized to help you get out. The other was he moved from $1.5 million into home repair to $10 million, led by a community agency of Community People's Choice. So the community ambassadors asked, what's the most trusted groups of institutions? And would you be part of helping this institution move money from home repair out to people they know? The third is a refinance program, I think about $8 million or so, that is made to refinance, removing the credit score from the place to get people to refinance their house, guaranteed 3% for people who are going through COVID. The only thing that they have to have is a bank account. And so he has also leveraged conversation with local banks, right, to talk about the barriers that banks put in. So he's not only moving the dollars, he's also utilizing residents to help shift the local policy around the way banks govern the housing and development.
And is the idea there generally for government to get something started and then sort of step away?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. I think the grant I was talking about, because it really struck with me, I think was it a Lilly grant that you got? But anyway, one of the metrics was how many people, I think the word was parties, but I think basically what it was how many
Oh,
people
yeah.
gather. Yeah, I mean, talk a little bit about that, because that is so diametrically opposed to how we measure things now.
Oh, actually, so all the things that I just told you came out of series of gatherings and parties. And it started out, I mean, so since 2005 or 2006, it's been a practice of Broadway United Methodists that have now multiplied out into community. So those parties, what we would do is invite all our social networks, not to talk about business, but to have mutual delight with each other. So sometimes to have a drink, to share stories. Parties showed us that people become their truest self. So in that, we would place listeners around those parties and to have us come back and tell stories. And we've gotten really, really good at it. And so everybody's been asking us about kind of how do we build those metrics out? Like, will we count? We can count. So all of the qualitative stuff has quantitative data over time. And so those parties help show that. The other thing is we would go back and we would, when money would come in, I remember one of the parties about 4 years ago, we threw, and it was the CEO of Central Indiana Community Foundation there, another philanthropist. And the day after that party, $1 million check got wrote. One, in that story, and I love it because that story was captured, like we hire these local storytellers to capture these stories, because otherwise people wouldn't believe they happened in low-income neighborhoods. So because of friendship, those powers shifted. That was how the Learning Tree started to connect with the Central Indiana Community Foundation. Well, it wasn't us that actually changed policy. It was the parties who influenced the people who can actually do it.
Right. I'm sorry, and I misspoke on the foundation. But think about this, everyone. That like those of us used to, like, did somebody get a job? Is somebody earning more money? You know, all the metrics that we use now, and one of the metrics that you used there was how many parties did we have this year?
That's it. How many parties? And in those parties, how many people got connected? How much money actually exchanged hands? So we can actually count that. But we also started to learn how to build that system. So when we first started this work, we didn't have that structure. When Blair talked about building the bike while riding it, we were actually doing that. But the key foundation is that we actually believed and acted like that. So one of the things that was principal about cultivating the structure is that we discovered there were guiding principles. April, would you put up the 5 rules? So John McKnight, he had an article in 1980, like 84, 85, called Why Servanthood Was Bad. And he wrote the 5 rules to protect yourself from becoming the agent of the devil in the middle of the church. And the first one is always my first one. It was my favorite because it illustrates power. Never do for others what they can do for themselves. My early work started out mostly with people with disabilities. I worked for several DD councils around the country. And when I would say this rule, everybody would cheer. And when they said it, because they said, no one will let us do anything. It is like that in my neighborhood, that people wouldn't let us do anything. So the first rule as an institution, it's a good way to start. The second is finding others' gifts, contributions, and capacity and use them. Give them a place in the community. Jalen and Jada's gifts, right? They were already there. Their family were born roving listeners. You have roving listeners like Wayne and the sheriff and other people in your communities, right? Find a way to use those. Go to the next ones. Whenever a service is proposed, fight to get it turned into income. So when people came to the food pantry, the thing that it told us wasn't that people were hungry. And in fact, we went to the emergency room and found out what was the food problem. You know what that problem was? Diabetes and hypertension. It wasn't people starving. And one of the things that's connected, people were poor, lack of access to economic opportunity. They had gifts. So if those in help bent, number 4, those in power hell bent on giving poor people services rather than income, fight for those services to become in form of vouchers. Choice is power. You want to build people's confidence? Let them make choices. We all fail at our own work, right? We all fall short. And one of the things that even from a policy standpoint, that we haven't even allowed people to fail. And in fact, some of the Nobel Prize winners for economics, me, Wildstyle, Pastor Mike, and a couple more people took a learning journey out to visit them. And they said that they add that that poor people are penalized for failure and people with means and plenty are supported, right? And he gave a story about him being he's from Mumbai, and wrote I forgot the book he wrote, but Poor Economics. And he said that he watched kids in the lower social class, when they failed school, they was put back. And they made an excuse for his family because of social things. And number 5 is practice hospitality. Now, I'm not saying that you use these. We started with these and we created the ones that fit us, but we kept a lot of the meat in this because we were curious about how do we use the gifts and talents. And that is the question we have here. And remember, we don't, in language also in structure is important. We stopped using needs-based language. And at one point at Broadway, if somebody used the word in a meeting, the word need, we booed. And it was interesting, it was funny, but it was the reminder that we start with gifts. So language like we empower. We don't empower people. People have power. The nature of just big old giant church in this formerly low-income neighborhood showed that it had power. So one of the things our jobs was to do is to shine the light on the power that is in community. Yeah. And when we talk about money, right? Money, we shouldn't talk about money as it's such a classist thing. I was thinking about how we often talk about financial literacy and training. There's a mother of 10 that lives across the street from me, and her bills are always paid. She got 3 kids in college, right? She's a grandmother, and still low income. And to me, one of the things we started doing is, if this is true, we went and knocked on the doors of our neighbors in about 4-block radius and changed the question. And we asked them, how much money do you give away to your friends and family because you love them? And you know you will never get it back. And they would start answer these questions. And what we realize is that low-income neighborhoods, once we start to change the structure and the platform, they become philanthropists. That's how we know who to put the money, this $100,000 in the hands of, right? We built a structure for people's gifts to be useful.
So we're sitting here in Noble County. I see this up on the screen, removing barriers, but we're sitting here in Noble County. And the question, this is a simple question that probably shouldn't be simple and probably has a complicated answer. But where do you start? Where do you start? Because we are also, I'm just going to speak for others here, and if they're not like me, then I apologize. We're so linear focused, right?
Mhm.
It's, you start with this leader who talks to this leader, and eventually, you know, it grows into something. Where does it start? In your case, it started with a church.
Yes, I think everybody's in a different place, and I'm gonna pick on Blair for a second. One of the things that I've been watching Blair, where she starts with, is that she start with noticing where her power lies, right? And the idea of just the name, when you say the governor's work for a cabinet, no matter where you go, imagine plopping that person in a low income neighborhood. I remember first meeting Blair, and she was so gracious at moving away her power, the barrier of that image of having that power to build relationships with people. So in government, right, in her space, she's starting there. Um, the other place you all are starting at, Rick, that is a very powerful place. I think we started there, is the learning journey, right? Groups of people willing to learn what learn their own power and visiting things that might excite them to be more imaginative. That's a start, right? So I'm saying that any of these places, I personally started, my grandparents started, right? What started it for the church is friendship between Mike and I when I was in South Bend, right? It was his in your own self, the 3 feet around you. How do you shift the paradigm in your own relationships, right? So whether they're your private relationships, that's not part of your vocation, and you start not just asking the question, but holding those to your neighbor. What is that person's gift? What can I celebrate in that person? So self is that one place to start, and that's what I appreciate about Blair doing that work. But the other, be prepared to not to finish this work. Like a lot of the things that the unintended consequences, and I'm more developed now than I have been before, but this idea that be willing to share all of this knowledge and this culture and pass it on as a practice in your community, right? And so Jalen and Jada are just one example of that. But there are many examples of that all over the city of Indianapolis. And I personally had to let go that any ownership to that. And so that is key. The other is having good people around you. So people call me an administrative nightmare, right? And I am very well connected person. Don't have a high school diploma, go through depression. Everything you can say is wrong. But one of the things that I find value, I put people around me who develop me. Not the word training, develop. So Shauna Murphy, even though she sits right next to me when we go to church in the pews, right? She's been friends with Mike longer than I have been friends with Mike. So friendship, we should look at that. That is a blob white structure. Look at the people around you. Noble Way, I feel, is doing that, right? That's what you're building, this trust with each other, discovering your own gifts and assets, taking learning journeys, and you are putting people around you who help develop you.
Questions?
Blair, you wanted to add? Did Blair want to add anything?
She there? Says she's there.
It said that's okay. We'll go to questions.
Shimada, they don't have any questions. If you're all a little like me still at this point, which I suspect you are, we have started it. Noble New Way has started it. We've started this. But the next question is, what's the next step, right? And who leads that step? And my guess is that at some point a decision has to make, kind of like jumping off a cliff. And that's kind of where we are, right? These discussions are great. They're fantastic. But at some point, we need to take that leap. And so anyone else sort of feel that way too after hearing everything that you've heard thus far?
Well, I haven't, this is Kay Craig, and I haven't been necessarily involved very much with this, but I'm just, just the whole thought process is really what I've been trying to do all by myself over here at the ARC. And what is so, I don't know if I get it all yet. I don't know, because it's just really been this morning where I decided I was going to make time to listen, but I've been trying to do this all by myself. And so to me, maybe it is just joining hands and all of us understanding what we're all trying to do by ourselves. For me, that's what I feel, because when Angie put up, what did you put? These issues are the reason we stopped accepting state and federal funding. What keeps me going is how do I move away from my funding sources? Because when I move away from my funding sources, then things happen. And
That's a good.
so maybe just understanding, like I say, I'm new to whatever y'all been doing, but I think there's so many of us out here trying to do similar things. I don't know what that means.
Well, I like your I say you do know this work, based on the comments you made earlier, you know this work. But I think one of the things I was thinking about the ARC has had in the past, our John Dickerson, is a good friend of mine, used to run the ARC for the state. And he often comes to the parties, right? And I was just thinking one of the things you might, like who's gonna join this with you in your place at the ARC? Like what connections around the state or around your community would start to join this practice? Who could you have cyber lunch with to start talking about this, right? And what other connections may this group in here have and support? So the coalition building becomes super important.
Yeah, and I would just, oh, go ahead. I was just going to point out about moving away from, state and federal funding. I would tend to look at it, well, I understand why some people might, but I would also tend to look at it differently. And I think Blair was extremely transparent and open today. It's an asset. It can also be a liability. I think moving forward, what we have to look at is how can those sources of funding support, whether it's financially or whether it's in practice or policy, how can they support efforts like this?
Absolutely.
So I don't know how you feel about that, but I don't think we should be turning away resources. We should be including them and, and figuring out how do we include them and how can they be helpful?
And I think the big question is that the way I've even been part of federal projects, April's been part is really moving one, International Museum and Library Sciences, but rules can be shifted, policy can be shifted, but it's all about how we have trust and relationships. So I think locally, why the money can be moved, that much money can be moved, is one that Jeff had built a relationship and became vulnerable and said, city government ain't as imaginative. So he started putting people who were very imaginative around him, right? And he started trusting the few relationships that he had in community. So funding can be shifted and shaped. The other is because of you all are very connected in your respective communities, on your boards, you can start to shape policy, or in the community foundation, start having those conversations. The community ambassadors here now write the rubric, right, for a specific set of grants. So they remove barriers in the 3 grants that the grant that they created was the first grant was the Neighborhood Relief Fund, and it moved into something else. But the only rules was treat people with dignity, believe them, right, and make sure money flows into the hands of people. I'm not saying that you do this, but what happened, why that was able to happen because we were being intentional about shifting policy by having lunch and dinner with those who make those policies.
And I want to add here too, the reason that we stepped away from the particular funding that we have or had was because it was keeping us from, it was a barrier for us moving in this direction. We kept bumping up against it time and again, trying to get outside of the normal box of one-way giving. And finally had to come to the conclusion that if we were really going to do this, we had to take some risk. And you know, that's something that goes along with this. You know, we talk a lot in our, well, I think my staff is all on board here. I think they know that when it comes to change, you know, we're willing to try things. And you know what, if it doesn't work, we don't call that a failure. We call that a building block or a learning experience. And, you know, for us, it was not a decision lightly made to step away from funding sources that were keeping us from moving in this direction. And I was fortunate to have a board that that supported that decision and understood that decision. Not to say that down the road there may not be something else, but for that point in time, we couldn't move forward if we kept what we had. So it was that letting go that we talked about earlier that had to take place.
Oh, Diamond, you're muted.
I'll close it, April. You hear me? I'll close it out. But one of the practices you can do, thinking about people you work with, friends, you all put some money together in a pot. Go to somebody that would need services and figure out ways to invest in that person. And one of the things we practice in our neighborhood, I think we give out about $100,000 a year. And remember, our median income in our neighborhood is about $25,000 to $27,000. So we give out this much money and we give them out in small grants. And what we do is tell the three things we tell people to fail at least 3 times. They look at us like we crazy. We don't do anything obscene or illegal, right? Though we might stretch on the illegal end because slavery was once legal. So meaning that some of the laws, or I should say rules or norms or practices don't make sense, right? So the way we report. And then we ask people, you can't do anything alone anymore. Try that with your staff. Have people commit, I don't know if it's $10, and you invest and you celebrate once you give that investment, right? And then you just go collect a story about it over time. Because if you are intentful about building a relationship, this will become a practice. All right, so any other last thoughts before we wrap up? Anything, Rick, you wanted to make any?
No, I think it's been a good session. I think that, oh yes, you can hear me. I thought I might be muted. It's something that those of us who have been working with this for a while have been thinking for a long time, but we do know that we're at the point. I'm really thrilled to see the people that are in on this call, because certainly we need to do some follow-up in figuring out how to make all of this happen. But what's clear to me, and has been clear for some time, that this kind of approach works. We just have to figure out what is our approach beyond today.
Okay, April.
So yeah, so this is perfect timing. As we're all our gears are all turning about exactly what you just said. How do we do this in our own way? We wanted to create some time during this call before we all go back out into our own worlds to each think about that. Just take a little time to think about a couple of questions to get our own kind of next steps, our own plans together for the unplannable, which is, trying this out. As Diamond always says, you got to plan to fail. And there were some great advice, some great practices shared about how we can set ourselves on the road, but really recognizing that it's really a learn as you go, building the bike as you're riding it situation. And, some of the first steps are finding out who our friends are, who we can walk along this journey, and then trying this out in small ways. So we wanted to take about 15 minutes and just talk as a group. We're not a huge group, so we can do this. And think about that question that was posed earlier around grieving and what it is we need to give up to create space to do these new things we're talking about. So the question we wanted to put out there and talk about as a group, ignore the notes here on the bottom of the slide. We're just going to stay in a large group. Question is, what things would you remove in what you're doing to make asset-based work possible? So Diamond shared some examples of what they did in Indianapolis. Angie, you shared something that gave you freedom, right? Walking away from certain funding. So in your world and your work, including volunteer work you might be doing, what would you remove? And take about 2 minutes just to think about that on your own, especially for us introverts. That can be helpful. You can write it down, draw it out. All right. What did folks come up with?
Something that I've been thinking a lot about, and I found out some more about the legalities of it, is there are, it doesn't seem like having proof of address or a photo ID to get a library card is a big deal. But, we've talked about this in our nonprofit groups, and, I think Angie's brought it up that they have some funding to help get people IDs, because it's not as easy for people in the community as some think it is. And so, I was looking at, can we give out cards for people just to use digital resources? If somebody moves into the community, how can we get them a card right away if they don't have a utility bill or something like that? And, I found out that state statutes don't allow that. If we started doing that, then we could potentially be prosecuted or something like that. It was kind of scary once I found it out. So I don't have a lot of hope of, removing some of those barriers, but, I definitely let our staff know that if, we get patrons that come in that don't have the photo ID, don't necessarily have the resources to get that photo ID updated, that, the Common Grace has that opportunity to assist them with that. And is that still going on, Angie? I know it's been a while since we talked about it. Okay.
Yes, it is. And actually we're putting some structure around that, because the money we're able to use is Salvation Army money. And once we have our program, or have a way that will work with the BMV, because that was our barrier, is getting them to accept that Salvation Army check. Now that we have that done, the Salvation Army is asking us, well, can you teach others how to do that? So we're hoping to make this move. ID is just critical to so many people for so many things right now. And it's very difficult to maneuver, especially if it's state to state. So yes, we are not only still doing it, we're still working on how we can expand that so that it can help more people.
Yeah. So for us, it's not as much about removing a barrier as it is finding ways around the barrier to make sure that the people in our community who need the service are getting it and who can benefit from the service.
Thanks, Jenna. So what else would people remove? What can you see now that's in your power that you could remove from what you have to do to make asset-based work possible?
One of the first things that came to mind for me is just to remove some fear. My program is totally federally funded, so we have a lot of federal regulations, around what we can and can't do, and similar to Jenna by saying, like we're not allowed to do some of these things. But I think with Head Start and as a program and people being in this program for so long, we just take it for what it is and do what we can do instead of, being real advocates to, it's like we're afraid of losing funding or we're afraid of, things like that. So I think if we can remove some of that fear and advocate for some of the change that we see our communities need, then I think that could go a long way.
Mhm. That's
A
great-
lot of us talk about those, the way that not just federal funding, but the way people have things set up that kind of create barriers. And I think Angie had brought up banks, that they're having a conversation with local banks that have reached out to them to kind of change the way things are happening. And that's really already happening kind of in our community. We have kind of a restoration, which has relationships with the banks. So as they I'm losing the word, revamp the houses. As they do that, then they can sell them to people who may not otherwise be able to afford a house, because they can work directly with the banks. The banks understand circumstances, are helping them get the right kind of loans, educating them about, how to do things. So it's really, they're removing a barrier for home ownership for a lot of people. And, banks have a lot of rules and regulations, and some of those are, the ones that can are being brought down so that they can make this happen in our community. So it's great to see that.
Mhm. Yeah, and I love the point about fear and blending that with just being more open about advocating for this work, and whatever you are able to try, just talking about that. Sometimes we think these have to be giant sweeping, moving that the giant ship, like Rick was talking about, moving that 70 degrees. But even if you're able to move some small thing in your power and see something from that, you can celebrate that. And I'm a perfectionist, so I often hesitate a lot, and even just in seeing something that I've accomplished or been able to see something from when I acted on the kinds of beliefs we're talking about. So sometimes it's so important also to have those good friends around you and build that crew that can help you see what you're accomplishing too.
So for all that was kind of, it started out at the church. And so my wife was super happy when I started working, but it's like it'll pay bills. But one of the things that I had realized, reflected on what April said, I was doing all these trainings all over the country, and I wasn't happy because the neighborhood around me was there. The good thing about it is I had a lot of social networks. I'm talking about large, and that was unintended. I didn't know. I started to discover that. So I actually needed to put people around me, and that's why we created the learning tree. So all my neighbors that are part of this are my business partners. So and they make a good wage. I live what I say. They make very good money, but they give 20 to 40% of their income back. I say this because that has been one of the things that has carried this work. If it wasn't for the people around me, the people that usually go to get services also discovering their power at the same time I'm discovering mine. That sense of agency is there. So this sense that how do you utilize people's gifts by just changing the question on your intake forms, right? I love it. What Jenna was talking at the library, right? An opportunity. Librarians get to know people, and they automatically know people's gifts and talents. And what would it be for people to circle around the library to support its work financially? So a community foundation going in to say, hey, we would like to support it, because that's a natural place of doing it. The other thing is when you start to leverage, the reason why we were able to leverage the dollars in support, because we leveraged our own. We counted as residents, right? We only have that power to count our capacity. So when we can say every year we probably give out $100,000+ in the full bark radius, that's power to know you can do that. And so that leverages, people want to play with winners. People want to play with people who have joy in their life. And that paradigm shift is figuring out, how do I support the next person?
You know, I had a thought with something that you just said. I'm not in a position where I'm, making the decision, but, maybe one place to start, one of many, you just mentioned, even if it's not a metric, what if we added a question or two on an intake form, even though we don't intend to measure it in the traditional way, to get not only the people who are providing services, but the people who are seeking services to start thinking differently. That may be one small way to do it, even if it's not part of the official measurements. You're muted.
I love that. That's a great, and that right there takes, but it's not a super big risk, right? There takes a little bit of time, and you're not changing it all at once.
So to Tammy, I agree with what you said. We sort of work together, not you and I, but Brightpoint and Northeast Indiana Works. And you're absolutely right. I mean, there are some hoops there that have to be jumped through, but I'm just kind of wondering if maybe in an unofficial way, we can start moving in that direction until we can convince, the big giant monster that we all have to work with, that maybe there are different ways of doing this.
And Rick, so building on that, so you suggested adding something. So before we kind of move towards wrapping up today, I also want to ask not just what would you remove, but what's running through your mind about what you would like to try out, how you could see building something into your structure as you're making space in it, to begin connecting people's gifts, to begin flowing investment differently, to begin building mutual delight into the work you do. Any ideas, anything that's just, even if you're not sure about it?
Yeah, hey, throw something out there. Doesn't have to be official.
So one of the things that we had started doing before we ended up not being able to have people in our building and having to have them come in one at a time, we had this great little seating area in our food center where people were beginning to build relationship with one another. And we had these 2 bulletin boards that we just put up. And one said, what could you teach someone else how to do? And the other one said, what would you like to learn? And we had this great idea of beginning to connect these things and using local resources. Like if somebody can play the guitar and someone wants to learn how to play the guitar, then we send them to the library where they can check out a guitar and use a room there to do that lesson. So, a lot of the things that I think some of us may be thinking through, it's like there's this now this added layer of this COVID thing happening that has made those things a little bit more difficult. But, I have a friend who's a pastor, Tim Johnson, who has this great saying, and it is dream big, start small, go first. And I love that. I mean, I feel like we're eons away from where we want to be, and that the steps that we've already taken are baby steps. But those baby steps are part of the reason we're all sitting here right now. So I don't think there's any step too small or too insignificant for people to think of. So don't be afraid to think, even if it seems like it's small to you, it might be completely impactful on another person's life.
I think sometimes we just have to talk about it. I mean, we have our Noble New Way group and we talk about it a lot amongst ourselves. And, I made the decision about a month ago to go to another organization that I thought was making great community connections and discuss it with them. And, they didn't realize quite the ability, I guess, to make connections that they had right there, in what they do every day. And, we discussed some ways that they can take the opportunities that they're creating right now and invest in people, connect people's talents with those people who are looking for that talent. And I think they really had their eyes open to what was possible. So I think, just us talking about it more, less amongst ourselves and more to other people, I think is a really great way to get us started in the community because, word of mouth works great.
Mhm. Jenna, that's a great point. And having that balance of having that safe group you can talk things through and having someone new. Diamond, I liked what you say about, just being committed to sharing, being open to sharing.
Yeah, a little practical thing as an institution. Blair is actually doing this, right? Because she did what Rick just said. I mean, not necessarily adding a question, but she's very informally added a new practice in. And so one of the things you could do is hire somebody in your community, preferably hiring somebody that is either a good connector, a good listener of gifts and talents, or a good celebrator, right? And hiring them to be in the place and figure out, like, how might they help you? So the question is, what is it that this person can teach you that you didn't already know? And so that's what Broadway did. They found the resources, they had the connections, and you all have that type of connections at some point to figure out, maybe it may take some time, but create a new position. That's formal, informal practice.
All right. So if no one has any other burning thoughts, we wanted to move into hearing from New Noble Way. And I just really want to celebrate you all again for this amazing community practice that you've built, starting with each other and then just opening it up, inviting other people in. This has been a really amazing conversation of just mutual learning. So I wanted to invite you, Angie, to share your commitment going forward.
So when I came back from Aurora, my head was spinning probably about as much as yours are all spinning right now, and really it took a while for us to come to a point of deciding what did we want to do as Noble New Way. This is not the direction we started out in. And we came to a moment where we had to decide, are we going to be done here at this table? Have we done all that we were called to do? Or is there something more that we can be doing? So we came to the conclusion that, this work is too important to just walk away from it, to not tell other people about it. So what I want to give you is our vision and our mission and our pillars for Noble New Way. So our vision is to walk alongside Noble County neighbors who are ready to make positive changes. Walk alongside. Don't do things for them that they can do for themselves. But you know what? Sometimes there are things we need to take another step forward. And maybe one of us with our connections has that tool that they need to step forward. So we share that with them. But when they need it, we don't try to take control of their journey. Our mission is a dedication to the promotion of asset-based community development principles throughout Noble County. And I think that's even beginning to go beyond our borders without us really having that intention, but it looks like that might be happening. And our pillars are exciting. I mean, I think our pillars are exciting. And they are this: to learn, to create, and to engage. We're learning everything we can about asset-based community development and about our neighbors. So, it's always learning from one another. We never have all of the answers. So that's one of our pillars, to always be learning. We're creating techniques to promote asset-based community development. This webinar is one of those techniques. We're engaging Noble County residents and entities in ABCD initiatives, and we're engaging our internal resources, those things that come across our table as our connections grow, to support our community with statistics and connections and whatever it is that we can bring together at our table. So, my question is, what's on your table? What do you have around the tables where you are every day that you can bring to this work? We would love to hear your thoughts moving forward. So be on the lookout for a response form that will be getting out to you. We want to give you some time to think about this, and we'll be asking you some questions. And remember, there's a landing page, and I don't know if, Jenna, can you put that landing page back up for us again, the Noble New Way landing page, where you can go to keep an eye on what's happening, to contribute to what's happening. We opened this up for a reason. We didn't just come here to tell you about it. We're inviting you to engage in it and to learn from it and to create your own avenues wherever you are. So Jenna's going to put that up for you.
Angie, did you still want to do the commitment share?
I would. If you know already what you might do, then you please share that with us now, and please let us know what you're thinking. And if you want feedback, if you want to get involved and have us connect you with other things that we've learned, we're certainly happy to do that. So what are you thinking right now? Where might this go? You're all drowning from the fire hose right now, aren't you?
Well, I would say what I see is growing these relationships here. It was very beautiful that you guys helped put Blair, and she's going to talk about this work to her folks too. And so I think, Andrew, you said it right, that it's already beyond your borders.
Angie?
Yes.
This is Melissa.
Yes, ma'am.
I think it might be neat too. I'll elaborate more on our questions when you send them, but maybe looking at some of the folks that you're working with and formulating some kind of a small focus group, small discussion group to find out what kind of skills and training they're looking for. A lot of times we say this is what we think people need, and HR tells us this or whatnot, but when we talk to the actual individuals, they tell us a lot they need. And we've got the CLC in town. We've got all these opportunities to provide great things for the neighbors. And so it'd be great to talk to them.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
Anyone else? Okay, is there anything else from Megan? Yes.
I keep thinking of overlapping themes. I know that the mission and vision of Noble New Way isn't the same as systems of care at like a state level, really with the primary focus being mental health for youth and families and access to services. But there are so many overlapping themes. You really can't have a healthy asset-based community without a mentally healthy community. And that's on the individual and at the collective level. And what I see with this group is collectively, you've got it. You've got the passion and you've got the heart and you've got the head and you have that collective talent and passion. And what I'm taking from this meeting is, in terms of infrastructure, where do you go from here? And I just my role is to really kind of help with the community in terms of developing that infrastructure, but organically, you guys are already doing it. So that's kind of in my role. I've been kind of hands off, but at the same time, I keep hearing themes. Even at the state level, I wonder in terms of like the Governor's Council, in terms of economic development, where is the conversation even with under that realm of FSSA and the Division of Mental Health and Addiction? I feel like they should be working together as well, not just at the state level, not just at the federal level, but at the local level as well. I feel like you can't have people going to work each day. You can give them opportunity, you can recognize their strengths, but if they are not mentally well, if they're struggling with addiction, if they're struggling with community trauma, or just historical trauma, and they're not getting the help that they need, and we don't overcome that stigma, it doesn't matter if you give them a good job, they have a great education. I mean, well-being is completely relative when it comes to economic stability. So I see us coalescing here, and it's beautiful. But I'm trying to figure out how I can do my part. I only have funding for so long. And also being the coordinator for 4 counties has definitely been a hurdle for me. I haven't been able to really be in the meat and potatoes of each community, which has been a struggle for me. So really it's about a coordinated network, not just of differing coalitions. So I'm excited about the work you're doing, but I'm also excited about the opportunities of kind of learning from each other and how we can take methods and practices and learn from each other. So I'm putting myself out there, kind of give and take what you want, give what you want, but I don't know, I just want to make sure that I'm out there and you know that I'm here, just to contribute wherever I can. So
Thank you, Megan. Diamond, you're muted.
Sorry, Megan, may I clarify something? I really appreciate what you said. And I really appreciate the vulnerability in that work. Did I hear you saying if somebody was to help organize some type of little in your region, you'd be part of that?
So I'm the coordinator for,
you are the coordinator
for the systems of care for all 4 counties in Northeast Indiana.
Awesome.
I've been in this position for 3 years. It's great funded by the state. I think that it really hasn't, it's been on the coordinator to keep that momentum when it's the ultimate success of systems of care is on the community. My job is just to make the phone calls with the right people, the people who are doing the work, and bringing them together. And then basically building that infrastructure and recognizing best practices in the community and understanding democratic processes and understanding when those legislative sessions, those windows are open to go and voice their opinions of the community, but also making sure that youth and family are at the table and that we're creating inclusive environments and that we're stepping away from our own biases and our own agendas, whatever agency that we're working with and whatever our personal mission is. We have to have that collective identity. And I think it's really important. You can't really make change, systems change. And I think systems care is what that is.
Like that.
Collective input in those efforts. And I've really struggled because I think there's a lack of trust with government, but I also think there's a lack of trust within communities.
Absolutely. Hey, one of the things that might a good question for you to find out in 4 counties, who are the healers in those counties?
There are a lot of people, honestly. Yeah. It's there are a lot of really good people doing a lot of good work. And I just, you know, those gaps between what they're doing just unfortunately sometimes exist. So Rick, I used to work in Alaska, the Center for Independent Living that I worked for in Alaska. It's called Access Alaska, and it was funded through Workforce Innovations and Opportunity Act under Obama, and then it switched to the one that you had discussed. And so very familiar with that level of work. And I think the one thing is like when somebody walks through the door, there's no wrong door. It doesn't matter if you're a bank, the police station, the library, the school, it doesn't matter. There's no wrong door. And so when that person walks in, you know, you're able to recognize what are their immediate needs, what are their emerging needs, and then what, you know, and then go from there. And so I guess I think that coordinated network, I think Noble County was already heavily connected. But how are you connecting? It's not if you're connecting, but how are you connecting? And then what are you connecting on? Like, what are you communicating and why? So from my angle, my agenda, because that's what that is mental health, youth and family mental health and well-being. So if somebody's coming in to get a job and you recognize that they're not doing so great, if they're struggling with addiction or they have family, just whatever it may be, you know, how do you prioritize their needs? And then how do you go from there? You know, sometimes getting connected to the right therapist, or really it's up to them too to decide, but connecting them to the right person to start off on the right foot.
So
So
I don't see these, Megan. That's really all great stuff. Alaska, huh? I always wanted to live and work in Alaska. I don't see these as exclusive.
mhm,
I see these as working side by side. So yes, mental health is
mhm,
a significant issue,
mhm,
and I'll just be, honest about this. About 30 years ago, I had some issues with mental health too. So I understand the importance of
mhm,
mental health, but I don't think that they're exclusive, which is to say, people who are suffering from mental health issues, if they are given opportunities to share their gifts, that might be a partial answer to helping them in the place where they're at. So I see the services that we provide can work hand in hand. I don't think that they should be separated, right? Um, when people value themselves,
mhm.
that clears up an awful lot of things.
Absolutely.
Is there anyone else that wants to share a little bit about what your thoughts are in relation to what we've heard today? Or what you
Yeah.
might do with what you've heard?
I do, just real quickly. I really liked what Melissa shared about, and she's gone, but her idea about doing some focus group work. I think that's something that would benefit the group. Also, I liked what Diamond shared about, I don't remember the exact framework for this, but giving money or doing with money and turning opportunities into income, I think. But I like the idea that you kind of use the money as seed money. We used to sort of do that at our church. Everybody in the church would get $10 at right before, I don't know, a month before Christmas, like on Thanksgiving. And it was up to you to take that, like the story of the servants who hid the money, who increased the money, or who did well with the money. So we were given the opportunity to do that, either use it as seed money to create something to sell and put that money in at Christmas time, or just give the $10 back. However we were going to do that. So that's the first thing I thought of when you said that, using that as seed money. We have some funding available, and I think exploring a way to do that, to use that seed money in a way that helps oh, my brain just froze. I love being 60, not. Anyway, you understand what I'm trying to say, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, that was right. That's right. That's good. I was just thinking, one of the things that, an example, it was probably a 3-week process or a month process putting a contract together. But one of the things they kept knocking out, I remember, Blair, we kept going back to her, money must flow to the hands of people we hire. And the people we're hiring are the people who, one, are good and engaging, but they also people who don't have money, right?
Mhm.
So we're not going to ask for people's time. And so we leveraged that relationship was our currency, right? So the relationship with Blair and that trust that built up is saying, go back to the drawing board. How can we put money in the hands of people? And so that was the great thing about that contract too. And all the timelines went out the window. By legally, it's supposed to be in by December, but we're going to carry it on. I didn't make that decision. That the connection with Blair, her power, her social network, she leveraged that in our relationship to do that.
Mhm.
So I think you all have that capacity.
Yeah. Becky, did you have something you wanted to say?
Well, I'm sorry. I kind of had to miss for a little while to go take care of my drug-free meetings. So I've missed a little bit of this in it. But I really feel like when we look at that video of where Wayne was at, I don't know how we actually do it, but his bravery and standing up and doing that is enormous. But even more than that, his pride in self and what he is able to do for his little piece of his community is I don't know how to duplicate it, but we need to help him share it more. And because I think that's you finding those connectors, like he's a natural connector within that community. So we just have to work harder at finding those connectors and then supporting them in a way that makes sense. You know, whether that's connecting them to Max so that they have a little bit more knowledge about what being a security guard is all about, or what exactly it is. But I think those are where we have to go to, is find the right people within those communities that we are trying to draw out the assets from, because the assets are already there. We just don't know who they are. And I've been really quiet for all this meeting, so I am really proud of myself.
Oh man, Becky, but you was right on time. What a very powerful. And that's a practice too. I mean, I think what Becky said is probably a collective effort between all of you, is finding out who those connectors are.
Right. Well, we're coming down toward the end of our time together today, and I want to thank. I think Blair has gone now, but I don't know. Is she with us or not with us?
No, she's not with us, but she's been sending emails. I just
Okay.
received one from her, and Diamond just received one too. She also recommended a book that I'll share with all of you. It is called, let me get it here. It's called Team of Teams, and it's by General Stan. I'll spell the last name, M small c capital CHRYSTAL. She said that the book is about how the special forces were transferred from a hierarchical system to one of a network in order to better adapt to ever-changing threats. She noted that obviously we're not dealing with the military here, but she thought that that might be something that might be food for thought on how we go about moving forward. So I share that with you.
Thank you. I also want to thank April and Diamond. The work that they have done, if you can get a chance to go into the ABCD Institute and just read about their work and about the work of others, it's very inspiring. Get yourself on the ABCD Institute has a newsletter that comes out. There's one called Building Blocks that comes every month. It's very interesting to read because it's all about what other people are doing, and it gives you a lot of ideas. So just want to, if we could all just give our thanks to Diamond and April for being with us today and helping us to bring this to you. And we just thank you for your attention and look forward to seeing how you might interact with us. Don't forget that landing page. We've got a Facebook page, Noble New Way, and we really look forward to seeing you. So thank you and have a great rest of your day.